Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana paints a grim picture about the country's public finances ahead of his medium-term budget policy statement next week. South Africa will host the 20th African Growth and Opportunity Act Forum from the 2nd to the 4th of November. And the Matric class of 2023 will begin writing the National Senior Certificate from tomorrow. And a very good afternoon. We're coming to you live from our studios here in Johannesburg. Thank you very much for tuning in. Now, this is The Week Ahead. I'm your host, Mfundo Mabalani. Leading our bulletin this hour, the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has painted a grim picture of the country's public finances. Now, this is ahead of his medium-term budget policy statement next week. Delivering a keynote address at the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation's annual forum in Drakensberg, Godongwana warned that the country or current government debt, which is due for repayment and high debt service costs, could erode government's available resources. He also signalled that government may continue to increase borrowing to avoid massive reduction in expenditure and to avert the risk of running out of money.
Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana gave a glimpse of the dire state of government finances. He says government is running out of money amid weak economic growth that has led to lower tax revenue. Despite lower revenue, government expenditure is growing fast. Godongwana will use his medium-term budget policy statement to announce measures to curb runaway expenditure. He says government will have no choice but to increase its borrowing to maintain some of the current expenditure.
First thing we've done is to manage this in a more prudent way. Do a combination of cutting expenditure and bumping up borrowing. Let me tell you the numbers now. We've been forced to bump up borrowing a bit, more than we have predicted in the year, because if we didn't do that, the cuts would have been more massive. So we had to do a combination of both.
Godongwana is concerned about the country's rising debt levels. Debt is incurring high service costs averaging 366 billion rand a year. This is more than what government allocates to the Department of Police annually. And with a number of government debt instruments maturing this year, Godongwana says government could risk running out of money.
If we see that the police budget in this current financial year is 111 billion, health is about 253, education is about 306. Debt service costs are the single biggest item, sitting at 366 billion. What complicates your problem is that not only you've got debt service costs, you've got to redeem all debt. The next pack of slides that you see there is debt resumption. This year alone, the amount we're going to redeem is such that if we don't do anything, we won't have cash by the end of March, starting from December.
Economists say these measures are aimed to assist government to extend the social relief of distress grants further. Government is widely expected to implement budget cuts across departments and state institutions to safeguard pro-poor social projects as the country prepares to hold national elections. Tshepo Mongwai, SABC News, Drakensberg.
Now, still on the mini-budget, the Democratic Alliance has called on government to ease the pain of the high cost of living. The party has submitted a memorandum of demands to the National Treasury in Pretoria. This is ahead of the midterm budget policy statement. Part of its demand is that Treasury should introduce a Section 77 money bill to cater for the poor who continue to suffer in this harsh and economic environment.
The Democratic Alliance has accused government of not doing enough to assist the poor. That as South Africans continue to grapple with the high cost of living. And as we head closer to the medium-term policy statement, the DA says it will keep a watchful eye on the finance minister's speech. It says it wants Enoch Godongwana to add additional items to the zero VAT basket.
We will be watching the budget process closely. Dr. George, who is our shadow minister of finance, is going to be in that lockup with the minister, where they're going to be going line by line in the budget to see where are you spending your money. Because we still are of the view that you cannot be spending 8 billion rand a year on private and security for ministers, but you say there's no money to alleviate the fuel levy. You cannot be spending billions bailing out failed state-owned enterprises that have been hollowed out by corruption, while you say that there's no money to extend the zero-rated VAT for basket of goods.
The Deputy Director General in the Finance Ministry received the memorandum from the DA. The DDG says he will deliver it to the Minister's office as soon as possible.
As you have seen in the agenda, the Minister is busy with the MTBPS, with Mr. George is aware of. So he asked me as a Deputy Director General to come and collect this on his behalf. I hope it is not a sign of disrespect to you as the DA. I will relay the message to him, but I have acknowledged your memorandum. I have signed for it, and I will make sure that it reaches his office as soon as possible.
The Democratic Alliance calls on government to readjust the food basket, impacting on the poor. It says the poor can no longer afford going to bed hungry. Nothando Makutulela, SABC News, Pretoria.
Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, South Africa will host the 20th African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as AGOA Forum, from the 2nd to the 4th of November. AGOA is an act of the U.S. Congress established in the year 2000 that provides preferential access to sub-Saharan African countries to U.S. markets. Some 35 African countries, including South Africa, are beneficiaries of this trade act. Participants in the forum will include U.S. Congress members, U.S. businessmen and women, labor representatives and civil society, as well as their South African counterparts, with governments, businesses and labor from other African countries also set to attend. All right, let's shift our focus to this story now. The South African Reserve Bank has raised concern about the high amount of currency in circulation in the economy. Reserve Bank's Deputy Governor, Funzi Shabazane, spoke to SABC columnist editor Tsepo Mongai on the sidelines of the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation Forum in KwaZulu-Natal. About 1.8 billion rand in notes and coins is in circulation in the economy.
A lot of issues that affect South Africa are coming under discussion. Issues of the economy, growth, and of course the central bank. To bringing into that topic, we are now joined by the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, Fundi Chazibana. You part of the panel discussion earlier discussing the issue of a payment system and the importance of the payment system and its infrastructure in terms of carrying this economy. Just share with us what actually came about.
Yeah, the payment system is an important contributor to how we move money around inside South Africa and also with counterparts in the continent and in the rest of the world. So this morning I was sharing with the panel some of the reforms that we are making to make sure that our payment system that we have in our country keeps up with the changing payments, continues to be accessible to the South African public, plus also how on the continent we are supporting regional payments and the progress that we have made with the SADC regional payment system and future work that we're doing to support the Africa intra-trade through expanding the connection between all of the regional payment systems. At present, SADC has its own, East Africa has its own, West Africa has its own, and we are seeking, working through the Association of African Central Banks, to bring all of the 3 regional payment systems. Hopefully it improves your costs and you start to see the benefits of this for trade.
How soon can we see this?
So central banks work slowly, but we do that in order to make sure that there are no interoperability issues. Meaning we don't want to say to you, it's going to be on tomorrow, but when you go and swipe your card, that's not possible. So the plan is we start the work now, we're moving towards 2026, but as we are moving forward towards 2026, we have to check, is this working? Are the systems talking to each other in the right way? Are we ready? So we will continually be reporting on the progress that we're making, but we're not going to rush too quickly to say, here's a system if the system has challenges.
One of the issues that came out is the enormous amount of money that is in circulation in South Africa. It's a concern, and you said that you are trying to deal with it. Just give us figures in terms of how much are we talking about and what's the impact on the economy?
Yes, so the cash in circulation in South Africa ranges anything from 160 billion rands to 180 billion rands at different points in time. And that does present a number of challenges for us as individuals, but also for businesses. It also limits the types of transactions that we can interact with. It also presents a set of vulnerabilities, because when you lose your cash, you have lost your cash, as opposed to the cash being in an electronic wallet or some other form of payment. So what we're seeking to do is to reduce the amount of cash that we use today by having payment platforms and payment mechanisms that are accessible to all of us in society, and to allow us to make the payments that we need to make. Now, that means that traditionally we are used to payments that go through the banking system. We are looking to allow more non-banking users to become users of the payment system, and to also have payment mechanisms that talk to the type of small payments that you might need if you're an informal trader at a point in time, so that we have a full range of payments mechanisms.
And I'm sure that breeds a lot of criminal elements as well.
There is that. You will recall that there have been endless conversations that happen about how much cash is crossing the border, who is keeping track of that. That is the responsibility of the revenue authorities. But between us, I think this is a body of work that we have to get done. As you know, we also move a lot of cash in transit, and that has been also a topical area in terms of how do we secure the cash. So if we were to have less cash in the system, we would certainly have all of those resources available to allow us to do more things. And we would be able to track what is the cash doing in the economy at present. And I think that having just cash moving around doesn't give us that ability to track what is the money doing.
We've seen, you're a member of the MPC, we've seen a lot of movement in terms of rate hiking. We're not sure what's going to happen going forward if we kind of reach the top of it. In the financial system, are we starting to see the stress that are being pronounced in the system as banks are starting to deal with high interest rate and consumers battling to pay some of their debt?
We are seeing signs of stress that are there in terms of non-performing loans. So this is the indicator that we look at as central banks. And in aggregate, we have seen an increase of around 28% relative to where we were this time last year. But it does differ from bank to bank. And we have to deal with the situation on a bank-to-bank situation. It is not systemically catastrophic at this point in time. So when we look at a system level, non-performing loans average about 5%. It's like a small number, but for individual banks, you then would see that there is variation in terms of the size. So we look to ensure that banks are managing the risk for themselves, but we also are having conversations with banks about how they're helping customers. You know that this is in the purview of the National Credit Regulator, but we are comparing notes between ourselves in terms of how the banks themselves are assisting customers in restructuring credit and ensuring that over the longer term we are seeing responsible lending behavior, and also over the longer term, we're seeing customers being able to afford to repay their debt.
Are you confident that the banking system will be able to factor in high interest rates if we have to implement more interest rates going forward? I mean, there's a talk of European Central Bank indicating that interest rate can go higher. We've seen with the producer price inflation, the numbers are quite high. Can the bank be able to deal with more hikes?
So there are some differences between us in South Africa and Europe, for example. So in South Africa, we are used to dealing with interest rate variability, meaning as individuals, we're used to dealing with variable interest rates, and also the banks know how to deal with interest rate risks as well. So we are saying, yes, there are risks to interest rate hikes. They come with that, and we are seeing the banks reducing how much they are lending to consumers. But if we do our work right as a monetary policy committee, we should start to see a continuing trend of what has happened, of inflation coming down. Remember, we are responding to high inflation. We are not just increasing interest rates for the sake of increasing interest rates.
Thank you very much, Fundi Chazibana. She's the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, saying that perhaps we could start seeing inflation coming down, although there are signs with the last print that inflation has gone up, but the picture seems to be of that inflation could come down and bring a lot of relief to consumers. From me, Tepo Mwai here in Drakensberg, it's back to studio.
Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, Gauteng Education MEC Madume has held a Matric pledge ceremony at Ponelo Pili Oracle Secondary School in Kalfontein near Midrand. The pledge is a commitment between various stakeholders in the province to agree that they abide by the rules during the upcoming Matric exams. Learners have also been assisted to prepare for the tests by participating in the Secondary School Improvement Program.
The Gauteng Education's MEC Madume together with other stakeholders, held a pledge ceremony as a way of encouraging learners to do well in their upcoming final examinations.
The pledge is a commitment between stakeholders, especially learners, parents, educators, school management, head office, all officials. It's a commitment that will run free, fair, credible, ethical examination process.
The department's target for this year's provincial matric pass rate is at least 90%, and in order to achieve this, they have initiated multiple interventions to help learners. The department launched study camps in the province for matric learners to attend for a period of 2 weeks. MEC has advised learners not to lose hope if they did not do well in their preliminary examinations.
We are going to give you the full support to make sure you pull through. Don't get despondent that, okay, I didn't perform well in my prelims, therefore it means I might not perform well in my final. It's not true. Many have come and didn't perform well in prelims, but they got distinctions in final.
I pledge to be honest with myself regarding my emotions and well-being.
Learners also signed a mental health pledge, which is meant to assist them in accessing the necessary support with regard to their mental well-being. They say they appreciate the department's efforts and that they are ready to take on their final examinations.
The pledge is just to show the seriousness of the examinations, and it's just the beginning of the examinations. It's the first step towards the exams, and the MEC coming here was just to emphasize on the seriousness of our examinations and the amount of effort that we have to put into our exams.
Taking part in the pledge shows us about reality, and it's a very big step for us. It's commitment, and it actually showed us the reality that we need to work hard, that life out there depends also on us, that we need to work hard for it.
The National Senior Certificate examinations will begin on the 30th of October. SABC News, Kalfontein.
Union President Busiso Malinga says they're confident that educators have done all they could in preparing grade 12 learners in KwaZulu-Natal for their final examinations that start tomorrow. Malinga was addressing union members at Matateni in Newcastle. This was during the commemoration of World Teachers Month. NATU also honoured its late president, Alan Thompson, by naming the union's Teacher Development Institution Hall after him.
Over 193,000 candidates will write their matric examinations in KwaZulu-Natal this year. In 2022, the province achieved an 83% matric pass rate. This was an increase of about 6% points from the previous year. Matric learners at Siamgela High School in Newcastle in northern KwaZulu-Natal say their educators have done enough to prepare them for their final examinations.
I'm back here in Newcastle trying to get better me, and I see all the people, they are assisting in many ways, and I love that about them. And also that I get the support from my teachers.
I feel we are ready because we've prepared ourselves enough. The whole year we're preparing for this time to come, so I feel we are ready, even though we are nervous for the exams because there will be no time to be rectifying our mistakes.
Mentally I am not, but physically I am, because either not, I'm going to write the exams. So for myself, I feel like I'm not that ready, but I am ready. But for the matrics, we are ready because our teachers were there for us.
Teacher Union NATU says the 42 schools damaged by heavy rains and strong winds last week will have a negative impact on arrangements for examination.
On the side of educators, they are ready. But the challenge is with the Department of Education. You know, we heard that more schools have been actually vandalized by the storm, I think last week. So I heard the department saying they will fix that in a very short space of time, of which I don't believe if you look at the history of the Department of Education in KZN. They failed to fix a number of schools that were actually, vandalized last time.
Malinga says the Department of Education is still facing many operational challenges.
Teachers lack motivation. Teachers have not received, especially the principals, have not received the money that should be deposited in their schools to run the schools. They have failed to deposit that money even last term. So the principals had to run schools from their pocket. They even went to Mashonisa to try and get money.
In a media briefing earlier this week, the department asked staff at storm-damaged schools to use undamaged classrooms as exam venues. Matric examinations will commence on Monday, the 30th of October, with English Paper 1. I'm Nonhlakani Pamakwaza for SABC News in Newcastle.
Now, South Africa will host the 20th African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as AGOA Forum, from the 2nd to the 4th of November. AGOA is an act of the U.S. Congress established in the year 2000 that provides preferential access to sub-Saharan African countries to U.S. markets. Some 35 African countries, including South Africa, are beneficiaries of this trade act. Participants in the forum will include U.S. Congress members, U.S. businessmen and women, labor representatives and civil society, as well as their South African counterparts, with governments, business and labor from other African countries also set to attend.
South Africa has been a key beneficiary of the AGOA arrangement since it started in 2000. AGOA is set to expire in September 2025, but African countries have been agitating that it be extended for another 10 years thereafter, with some modifications, including allowing for more product categories to benefit. The forum will be looking to focus on Africa's industrialization capabilities and the improved supply chain possibilities that should come with the African Continental Free Trade Area.
One of the significant highlights of the forum, and it's the first time it's being done, and we're very proud as South Africa that we could launch this, is a Made in Africa exhibition. 520 firms will be displaying their products at the Matric Center, and this is really going to be an enormous highlight. You'll see there from vehicle production to chemicals to food, clothing and textiles, services, just the range of activities in our economies will be showcased. And that will be attended by procurers. A number of American firms are sending their supply chain people and their procurers to come and visit and see what industrial capability there is on the continent.
Business Unity South Africa says much work is being done between business and government to get the local economy back on the right track, and that it's therefore imperative that we continue to secure mutually beneficial trade relationships with key markets like the United States.
AGOA is in the national and continental interest. This is an issue that business, labor, and government can very easily come together on, because the benefits of AGOA to the critical sectors in the South African economy are palpable and are quite clear. That leads to economic growth in the country, that leads to job creation.
The Black Business Council is also in support of government's position, advocating for increased local beneficiation and industrialization.
We are excited as the Black Business Council. We're looking forward to the AGOA forum next week, and we are in support of the country position that says that South Africa needs to continue to participate in AGOA, and also that it is extended for a further 10 years. And we, of course, from the Black Business Council are also aligned with the common messaging from our government to say that we need to look at how we scale the benefits of AGOA.
Labour representatives from the United States, South Africa and from the rest of the continent will have their own meeting ahead of the main AGOA forum to discuss burning issues. COSATU supports the push to extend the AGOA dispensation, adding that it's been responsible for the creation of a significant number of jobs, which South Africa can ill afford to lose. It's happy that labour formations have been keenly invited to be part of discussions at the AGOA forum.
It's an ongoing discussion, but at the center of it all for us, it is about decent work that must find expression within the trade agreements.
When asked around concerns that South Africa specifically could lose out on an AGOA extension due to political reasons driven by varying factors, Minister Patel suggested that his engagements with his US counterparts remain positive and focused on the mutual benefits drawn from the AGOA setup. Up to 2,000 delegates are expected to attend the forum next week. Nompumelelo Siziba, SABC News, Johannesburg.
All right, now for more on AGOA, we're joined by international relations expert and Professor Patrick Bond. Professor, good afternoon and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's always a pleasure. Now, the 20th AGOA Forum is taking place this week, and honestly, most have viewed it as the cornerstone of the US's economic engagement with sub-Saharan Africa. But just for the benefit of those who might not be aware, can you take us through the objectives of AGOA first?
Yes, it was put together 20 years ago by George W. Bush. So at the time, there was a need to reach out to Africa because of the controversial invasion of Iraq that had, cost 1 million lives and was seen as an imperial venture. I mean, it's sort of parallel in a way to the concerns people have about the US and Israel. And so there was even a former metal worker leader, Woody Arun, who said, no, we should take that into consideration, put the politics on the other foot. The politics of not just allowing more imports into the US, but trying to have a bastion against China, making the kind of advances it has with trade, haven't really worked. And that's partly because there's this element in the US that, especially in the last couple of years, since Donald Trump has come to power and the sort of empowerment of the MAGA, Make America Great Again, xenophobia and racism and protectionism. And that already was visited upon South Africa's steel and aluminium by Trump, just unilaterally restricting. Now, that's what we, I think, are all worried about for 2025, because he's leading in the polls between 2% and 8% the last couple of days against Joe Biden. And Biden may want to continue with what is essentially a sort of hyper trade deal. And yet, if we do lose those benefits, the ABSA report, the big ABSA Bank study this week said it won't make that much difference anyway, because
I want us actually to look at the particular sectors that have benefited more, because there's been also just that criticism that to a certain extent we're seeing that it's very concentrated around mining and automotive, as well as the chemical sectors, and very little on agriculture. Yes, our wine and citrus is there, but it's a very nominal amount. So we need to see expansion in that respect.
Well, on good years, they've been up to 20% for wine and for horticulture and other agricultural products. And those are labor intensive, but they're very, very poorly paid jobs, very oppressive conditions. So you're right, it's smelted products, petrochemicals, automobiles. Those take our electricity, and it's a very good time to ask the question, if huge state subsidies go in, if we're already facing sort of climate sanctions from the European Union that are going to come into effect in 2026, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and if we have so much reliance upon very capital intensive, a smelter in Richards Bay, the big one, BHP Billiton, 1,200 jobs. Now, there's some jobs up and down the line beyond that, but the main point is while we have electricity shortages, luckily not the last couple of weeks, then we really could think about labor-intensive industry, small businesses, women, in households in rural areas, having access to electricity and creating more economic benefits than what is going now to those capital-intensive. So you're exactly right to ask.
Because even with reports that I've gone through, it seems as though we've seen greater growth in products that we export that aren't benefiting from this AGOA framework, funny enough.
Yes, and indeed we've also fallen into a trade deficit with the US. And so the whole idea is to make it a bit cheaper to import from South Africa into US markets. But those can be extremely variable. We're going to start seeing on shipping carbon taxes. For example, the bunker fuel is very, very dirty, will make the shipping industry much less competitive. And that's, of course, the way that pretty much all these products that go through AGOA get there. So I think this is a tumultuous time, and we should be a lot more prepared if, not only because of geopolitics, we lose AGOA, although it's a little less likely today than 4 months ago. 4 months ago, it was punishing South Africa for the Lady R, which turned out to be a bit of a damp squid. It was fear of BRICS and the August Santon hosting of the BRICS. And then in the subsequent few weeks, I think the US Republicans have sort of come to their senses a bit and said, well, maybe South Africa should be a friend because China's the alternative they'll go to if they don't trade with us.
We did see some sort of a positive response post-BRICS. But if I take you back to the objectives and particularly the intention, I know there have been other commentators that have said, this was a commendable initiative or framework by America here, that beyond just sending trade to the African continent, which sometimes can be misused, they saw that here, perhaps we need to give individual companies in sub-Saharan Africa the opportunity to bring those products competitively into our US market and ultimately also growing the economy on the continent. So wouldn't you say that beyond the other agenda you speak of, of greater influence on the continent, that in fact it was commendable, that we cannot just be sending aid to the continent?
Yes, and the Millennium Challenge account of the US aid was meant to do that sort of balancing, and they have an ideology there that is free trade, free economics, and free democracy should go together, and they can punish you. They punished Ethiopia and Guinea-Bissau and a few others who've had coups or undemocratic processes by putting them out of AGOA. So there are various, let's say, political strings still attached. But of most importance is that the real beneficiaries, I can name them, BHP Billiton on steel, ArcelorMittal on, BHP Billiton aluminium, ArcelorMittal steel, and for the cars, it's Mercedes and Ford, a US company, BMW, VW, and the Japanese companies. So
it's the more bigger ones, yes, which has been somewhat the criticism here.
Yeah, and if you go to the other major countries that have benefited, Kenya, Lesotho, you'll find complications there, because if you want to import to the US some clothing and textiles, you have to show that the origins, the textiles that go into the garments, are from the region or they're from the United States. So it's quite a surreal, the textiles come from South Carolina, get unloaded, put into clothes and sent back. So the logic and the, let's say, implicit protectionism is still a factor. And I think some of these countries that have done okay are mainly oil exporters, the Angolas, Nigerias. They've been really the beneficiaries. And we're supposed to be moving into a society where relationships based on fossil fuels are less and less important, and we develop other parts of our economy. We need the same here, right? Decarbonization, and probably less emphasis on smelting. And if for example, our car industry were to come to the table with electric vehicles, then I think we'd all be happy to see a much more balanced kind of import-export. But unfortunately, it's still, it's all petrol and diesel exports.
So how can we address this particular problem? Because many are also saying that here we're seeing a great number of minerals that are being exported, but you've got an economy such as America, which is highly sophisticated. Perhaps we should be sending a bit of the manufactured goods a bit more to be more competitive. So how do we address that issue?
Well, we really have been deindustrialized, haven't we? We had 24% of our economy was manufacturing at the end of apartheid, and now
something
it's 12%.
that was discussed extensively within BRICS.
Yes, and indeed we've lost clothing, textiles, footwear, leather goods, appliances, electronics. We've just seen, really mostly from East Asia, much cheaper imports into South Africa that can be made at scale. I'm hoping the next generation of production would include the 3D printing, which localizes, and we could build up manufacturing. But you're asking, in a way, how do we have a stronger position? I think we need some Springboks in to do some negotiating for us.
No, there I believe we are. But then just in closing, there's a strong likelihood that beyond the 2025 deadline, we could get an announcement of the extension of AGOA. If they sit, or when they sit, should there be a discussion around refining the framework? If many economists are saying the benefits are very minimal, should there be a serious conversation around refining this very commendable framework?
Oh, absolutely, because, the more sophisticated ways of looking at the economy would be to include pollution and greenhouse gas emissions and the depletion of our minerals, because that seems like it's income, but it's also the depletion of our wealth. Our natural capital declines when we export these minerals, or smelt it or not. So I would love to see some sophisticated negotiating saying, well, let's see if we can use the electricity that goes into these exports better for ordinary people and create more jobs and small businesses. Maybe AGOA isn't all that it's cracked up to be.
Professor, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That's international relations expert and Professor Patrick Bond speaking to us. Let's take you to the story now. All right, we take you back to the midterm budget conversation. For more on this, we're joined by economist Dawie Ruud. Dawie, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your time. So this Wednesday, the finance minister, will present what is commonly called the mini budget, which essentially deals with departmental budget adjustments. And more importantly, it gives us some sort of an indication of the spending priorities for February. But can you just take us through its purpose before we get to the expectations?
Yeah, good afternoon to you. Well, the purpose of the medium-term budget policy statement, or mini budget as it's quite often referred to, is simply to give a bit of an update on what's going on in the figures in the fiscal accounts, and also to give some update in terms of what the minister expects for economic growth, inflation, and that sort of stuff. So this is not the opportunity for the Minister of Finance to make significant adjustments as far as expenditure is concerned, and certainly not significant adjustments as far as various taxes are concerned. This is basically just an update opportunity for the Minister of Finance. The big changes happens in February.
Then to the all-important, the expectations around real GDP growth. What are your predictions, given what has been consistently stated that there are serious risks to growth that exist due to a number of issues, among them being load shedding?
Yeah, the Minister of Finance started this year with expectations of economic growth about 1.5%. That was clearly far too optimistic. We know we've got issues with load shedding as an example, but also railroad issues and many other issues in the economy. And I think economic growth is probably going to be in the region of about 0.5% or even less. I think the Minister of Finance will make certain adjustments as far as that is concerned. But that is, of course, not only a matter of economic growth. That's also important to the Minister, because if the economy grows, then his tax collections are doing quite well. And that's certainly not happening at the moment. Because of very weak economic growth, tax collections are under tremendous pressure, and total tax collections could be in the region of between 50 and 100 billion rand less than the original budgeted estimates. It's not only weak economic growth, there are some other factors as well, like the commodity cycle, that has been under pressure. But certainly the economy is not doing well. And if the economy is not doing well, the Minister of Finance's tax collections are also under pressure.
You touch on rail infrastructure, and a bit earlier on last month, we were looking at the situation insofar as rail is concerned at Transnet, and we saw what was happening with most of these mining companies that were looking to retrench or even curtail their production purely based on the fact that they couldn't really move their goods to the ports. So how much of an impact has this situation around rail infrastructure really had on our economy?
Huge impact. The huge impact is certainly on certain kinds of industries, like, for example, mining is one, but agriculture is another one. But it's a combination of all sort of factors. In the case of mining, they have commodity prices that has been falling recently quite a lot because of weak international economic growth. So they've got low prices for their goods. You can't get the stuff out of the ground quite often because you don't have electricity. You can't get the stuff from the mine to the harbors because the trains are not working properly. And if you can get it to the harbors, you can't get it out of the harbors quite often because the harbors are not working properly. So all of that combined simply means that the mining industry is not doing very well in South Africa. But it's not only mining. Like I've mentioned, some other industries are also being affected. I think agriculture is a very good thing, a very good example. And we know that the government is actually looking for private partners to take over many of these railroads to see if they can do it better. But of course, that's a completely different issue but I think we need to talk about that as well. But clearly, the state is not very good at running the railroads and certainly not running Eskom as an example. And the private sector must come in to try to rescue what can be rescued.
But when we speak of the private sector, we know that then politics come into play here because there are situations where it's said even with state-owned entities that in as much as they're draining the fiscus, many are still quite apprehensive to agree to the private sector participating, always constantly stating that when you bring in the private sector, they are essentially for profit. So at any given opportunity, they're going to increase prices. So you'll make most of the most simplest of services that we should be getting, such as electricity, becoming unaffordable.
That is, of course, untrue. If you look at other things that the private sector provides, like, for example, let's look at the basic thing, like, for example, food. The state is not the provider of food. The food is provided by the private sector in South Africa. And food prices in South Africa are quite reasonable, actually quite cheap, if you compare it to the rest of the world. And we can actually get that. Or you can put many other things that the private sector provide. You can get that, and it's fairly well priced as well. In the case of electricity, which is provided by the state, for example, not only can't you get it, but it's quite expensive if you compare it to other countries in the world. It used to be fairly cheap in South Africa. That's not the case anymore. So it doesn't really matter if you've got something that is very, very cheap, but you can't get it. It simply doesn't make sense. So we need to get the private sector involved in these kind of things. But the reality is, I hear the debate about ideology, but the reality is the state is simply just not providing these services. Look at the post office, for example. This post office is just disappearing. Whether we like this or not, or whether we like the private sector getting involved or not, that is really irrelevant because the state is not providing those services. And if you want it, the private sector must come a step in and provide these kind of services.
And the state no longer has the capital to reinvest. So that also is an issue that perhaps you can use the private sector's capital. But in terms of expenditure, the public sector wage bill is often the biggest conversation. It remains a significant challenge to government's fiscus. So in this instance, what can happen there? Because again, or what are we expecting? Because again, there's always the politicization of the public wage bill. We've heard this even with alliance partners of the African National Congress. If you're looking to curtail spending in the public sector, then it becomes a problem.
Yeah, well, we spoke about the revenue side, which is under pressure because of weak economic growth. On the expense side, on the spending side of the budget, there are many issues there. The state-owned enterprises, like, for example, Eskom, and I see Transnet wants a lot of money, the post office wants a lot of money. So those are all expense items that the Minister of Finance quite often did not budget for. But of course, a wage bill is another major expense item on the budget of the Minister of Finance. And originally, the Minister of Finance budgeted for a wage increase of 1%. They ended with 7.5% wage increase. And we have approximately 2 million civil servants in South Africa, depending on how you want to define that. And if you compare South Africa's civil servants, and this is the reality, if you compare them to many other countries in the world, then our civil servants in South Africa are very, very well remunerated. If you compare them to other South Africans, they are quite well remunerated as well. If you compare the output of the civil servants in South Africa, and I think education is a very good example, then you will see that the output is quite dismal, it's quite bad. So we spend more on education than most countries in the world, as an example, but the outcome in South Africa's education is not only bad, quite often it is the worst in the world. But the reality is that the fiscal accounts have reached certain levels of unsustainability that we simply cannot go on like this. The state debt levels will reach, according to my estimates, about 75% of GDP this year, and it will get close to 80% to GDP next year. And we know that Labour in South Africa is very well organized, and we know that they can be quite disruptive and destructive quite often. But I think we need strong political leadership to tell, especially the civil servants in South Africa, that many of them are, quite often, not all of them, but many of them are simply overpaid and quite often underworked. And that we just cannot afford this huge civil servants wage bill that we do have at the moment. We have to get a return on that, firstly, and secondly, we have to understand that the state simply has reached the end of its financial means. The state's finances are in very deep trouble. If we continue on this, we are heading for a major financial crisis in South Africa.
My goodness, Mr. Root, what a dismal picture you paint, but hopefully there will be some sort of positivity when the minister does in fact address the nation. But thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That's economist Dawie Root, and that's where we leave it for today. We're back next week. Enjoy your afternoon further.